Well, thank you kindly. And kudos to you. It's such a pleasure to be here. I mean that sincerely. I am just so super blessed to be amongst those who, like me, live in this frontier world, this border world, stuck in what some construe as some kind of phantasmal state, endeavoring to carve out some space somewhere between things Jewish and things Jesus, and to hold in tension those interests. Of course, in so many ways, folks say, because we're interested in both, we have no right to participate in either. For Jewish people, we're too much interested in Jesus to be considered in any way seriously Jewish. And for Christian people, we're interested in things Jewish. You know, Jewish people, we're too Christian, so we can't be Jewish. And for Christian people, we're too Jewish. We can't be taken seriously. So we live in this phantasmal world. And it's my pleasure to be here with you because the objections of others notwithstanding, I am pleased to live in that world. I remember when I was a youngster, my father explained to me that if you look at a bumblebee, if you look at the size of the body of the bumblebee, it's very big. And if you look at the wings are very small. And if you look at the capacity for the bumblebee to flutter those wings, there's no way it can generate enough energy, enough lift to fly. So according to the prevailing laws of physics, everyone knew that bumblebees can't fly. The problem is nobody told bumblebees that. Even if it doesn't make sense to the way people think, nevertheless, they're just going to go ahead and fly. And so it's my pleasure to be with you, to those of my friends that are carving out space between these two experiences and trying to hold in tension the Jewish story and the Jesus story somehow. There's lots of forces that impress upon us to disengage from that enterprise, but kudos to you for your interest and your perseverance. This morning I'd like to muse around the parasha for today, Yitro. And similarly to rummage around the Haftorah portion in Isaiah. And as I was preparing my heart and my mind for this, I was reminded how sometimes life and Bible study can throw us curveballs and send things our way that we don't expect. And it reminds me somehow of these delineations between the Jewish people over here and the Jesus people over there, and that big chasm between the two, and never mind interactions between these alien perspectives. Sometimes that doesn't really, though it makes sense in some kind of sociological sense and psychological sense, the way people perceive, sometimes the biblical narrative is a little messier than that. I mention that because when you look at the Yetro story, if you look at Jethro in the 18th chapter of Shmot, Exodus, this is played out against the backdrop initially of Yetro, Moses' father-in-law, coming to him. And what we're reminded of in the text is that Moses' father-in-law wasn't even Jewish. He was a Midianite. Now, if you look at Midian, in antiquity, this is the northwestern part of Saudi Arabia in modernity. If his father was a Midianite, he carried a Saudi Arabian passport. And following that to the next step then if you look at Moses' wife was an Arab woman. Isn't it interesting that the most famous person in the Hebrew Bible was married to a non-Hebrew? Later on in the book Bamidbar, the book Numbers, there's an interesting story there where Moses' big sister, and you know how sometimes big sisters can tell little brothers what they think, whether the brothers want to hear it or not. Because big sisters, depending on how big they are in relationship, can be construed as quasi-moms to help raise the little thing. And anyway, we do know that Miriam, when baby Moshe was kind of thrown in the basket, it's Miriam who's following the basket down the river, and then she's the one that says to Pharaoh's daughter, I know a Hebrew woman that can take care of that kid. So she's been looking out for that kid ever since he was a kid. And in the 12th chapter of Numbers, Miriam is disconcerted, and it's very explicit because she can't stand her sister-in-law. And there, she drags Aaron into her contention. And specifically there, and it's repeated twice, it says that Miriam couldn't stand her sister-in-law, Moses' wife, because she was a Cushite. And then it repeats, because she was a Cushite. Now, Cush in antiquity is Ethiopia in modernity. So it begs the question, on the one hand, the father-in-law, and then the wife noted in Yetro in the beginning is noted as a Midianite. But then you have later, so we say, okay, Moses was married an Arab woman. And then you have in the Numbers text, explicitly Miriam taking issue because she was a Cushite, an Ethiopian woman. Is it that Miriam was a little racist and didn't like darker-skinned peoples? What do we have here? Did Moses marry twice? There's an argument, not the case, that if you look at the Midianites, they were mobile. They traveled around, akin to Bedouin. There was a circle. And it could very well be that this Arab woman was an Ethiopian woman on top. But it's interesting when you carve out, well, there's Jewish people over here and there's the Jesus people, and we got to keep all that stuff separate. Sometime when we look in the biblical narrative, things aren't as cleanly divided as one might think. And this is evidenced when we look at certain biblical noteworthies. Not only that, here's a story of this Midianite comes to Moses, his son-in-law. And Moshe Rabbeinu were 3 months since the Exodus. And Moses, who has spent 40 years prior to that schlepping sheep around in the wilderness, now has, according to the literature, a community where there are some 600,000+ men of fighting age that can bear arms, and extrapolating from that, wives and girlfriends, children and older folk, you're looking at a community of about 2 million people. And here's Moses, who is busy from morning to night trying to adjudicate amongst conflicted persons, as invariably will happen in a community that size. And here is this outsider who isn't even of the ethnic or religious persuasion as Moses giving him advice. Sometimes our purest minds, well, we can't hear from a psychologist. That's just worldly. And there's nobody that has anything to contribute toward us unless they believe in the same kind of religious way that we do. We just don't have, there's no room in our world for the help of the outsiders. Well, those of us that might be moored a little that way, then we need to help ourselves understand what are we looking at here when Moses allows himself to learn from someone who is not of his immediate ilk, but is still more qualified, a little more experience and knowledge, and can lend a hand. You understand? Sometimes things get a little messier. And what I want to do is explore some of that messiness with you this morning. I'm staring at some friends and I'm looking at a Star of David in the back. Never mind Moses' messy world. If you look at David, his great-grandmother she carried a Jordanian passport. She was from Moab. And this Jordanian woman, this Arab woman, came with her mother-in-law to Israel. And Ruth was so virtuous. The most famous woman in the Jewish Bible is a non-Jewish woman named Ruth. And she left such an indelible mark on the Hebrew people that to be without virtue is said to be, quote, ruthless. And never mind that for a second in a messy world. If one looks at the text, and I'm just thinking this while I'm staring at a Star of David in a minute, I want to stare at some biblical text. But just to prime the pump a little bit, how sometimes things throw us curveballs. Remember the story in the book Shmuel in 1 Samuel, where the prophet comes to the house and he tells the dad, listen, I think we got a king in the making here somewhere. Bring me the boys. And remember, Jesse brings one son after another, after another, after another, and David isn't even considered as part of the litter. And after cycling through this, the prophet says, well, I don't know. I kind of sort of thought I heard from God here, but, there's got to be someone else. And then as an afterthought, Jesse goes, oh, well, yeah, there's Davy, who was so disregarded that his father wasn't inclined to take him the least bit seriously or to even want to identify him as a possible candidate when the prophet asked specifically, bring me your sons. Now, there's some Jewish reflection on why that. And the argument is that David himself was a love child. He didn't even come to the family legitimately, but rather his father had a fling with another woman. But it gets worse than that, or more interesting than that, when one considers who that other woman might have been. It's just a tacit inference in the literature. It's not explicit. But if you can recall, when David is on the run from Saul, sometimes bad things happen to good people. I'm sorry to inform you. I know there's plenty of congregations. Come here and tithe, and we'll pray, and everything's going to come up roses. If that's what you're used to, please disregard what I'm about to share. But the last time I read the Bible, not everything is as clean and sweet as the messages of those that are wanting more and more people to come and hear the message might delineate. Sometimes misfortune comes upon people that have a call of God in their life. And when David is running from Saul, he hides in a cave. After that, we're told that some of his family have joined themselves to this fugitive. And what David does is he takes his family to Moab and deposits them with the king of Moab, who receives them without question and gives them quarter, which gives credence in certain Jewish eyes to the belief that not only was David a love child, but that his mother, like his great-grandmother, was a Moabitess. That is to say that David himself was part Arab and a love child on top. And if that perspective prevails, as is adjudged by certain Jewish expositors, then it helps understand a line in one of the songs we sung that hark to Psalm chapter 51. David, forgive me, give me a pure heart and a contrite heart. Do you remember verse 5 where David says, behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Christian expositors are minded to say, well, that's just giving credence to the doctrine of original sin, which is not a doctrine that Jews abide by. Growing up, I didn't know what original sin was. I thought it meant I had to come up with a sin that was original. Let me see. They pretty much done it all, but let me just give it. The line, behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me, is construed, if that prevails, as David just giving voice to his own lackluster origins. David makes his entrance into a world where he finds himself all too easily despised by others that inhabit the space in close proximity. And I mention that just by way of introduction in part, because here we are, inhabiting a border world in some sense, and we can invoke the ire of those in proximity to us for various reasons. Beyond that, I'm reminded of that as I put my eyes and heart a little bit on the story here and today in the 18th chapter. There's a story of this Midianite father-in-law who comes to Moses. It's fascinating stuff. Well, listen, I want to put this stuff down and open up the Bible, but if you're interested, I have some materials that'll be available during the Oneg. A book that I wrote recently is all about this frontier world in terms of Jews in relations to Arab peoples, called Making Our Peace with the Warriors of the Sand. And if you're interested in the question or wanting to explore all these interesting interrelationships between Jewish people and Arab peoples in the biblical narrative, I thought that the fact that we're looking at Jethro gives me an opportunity to talk about it a little. I only have a few of these, but it's yours for the asking. Beyond that, there's a cooperative biblical translation that I'm involved in working with, a classical treatment of biblical literature that's very popular in our Messianic Jewish world is David Stern's Complete Jewish Bible. And study Bible's coming out in that regard, and I was just asked and just finished writing a few introductions to some of the books. That'll come out this summer. Additionally, inasmuch as David as an individual did a wonderful job of helping to explore, looking at the Bible, the New Testament specifically from a Jewish perspective, on the heels of that, a cooperative effort of Messianic Jewish scholars all over the world. Instead of one person doing a translation, it was a cooperative. And Eitz Chaim, or the Tree of Life, is a new one that is worked on by committees and scholars from all the different segments of the Jewish believing in Yeshua world. And for those of you that are interested in that, I have that here. I was asked recently to be the vice president and the project manager as we're working through the whole of the Bible. But if you're interested in that, that is available to you as well. If you want to go to Israel, I have some flyers as well. I'd like you to open up your Bibles, please, to the book Shmot. And I wanted to begin with the Yitro story, the Jethro story, because I just think it's really interesting. The parasha, the reading for today, begins at Jethro, and we see Moses being respectful toward him and benefiting from him. We can get a little window into relationships between Moses and the Midianites, friendly, etc. In the 19th chapter, then, we come to this readiness. Something is about to happen. Moses is about to go up the mountain and get the luchos, the tablets. And what I want to do is pass through the 19th chapter and look at the 20th. I'm going to consider those tablets. Parenthetically, by the way, for those of you that wonder why so many Jewish people become doctors, you might better understand it when our principal story is a story about how Moses coming down and saying, listen, just take these 2 tablets and you'll be fine in the morning. So it's this whole inclination, it's just kind of wired into the culture. We just can't help it. It just is what it is. But I want to look at 2 aspects of the list of 10. And what I want to do is look at some of these pills. And I hope to, in conjunction with so doing, give you what I want to describe as biblical medicine for life's assorted hurts. And the first in this ledger of commandments, principally the one that I'm interested in, if you'll look in chapter 20, verses 1 through 12. This is where you have an affirmation of God, not taking his name in vain, a prohibition against idolatry, and then an exhortation toward the Sabbath in verse 8, 9, 10, and 11. It's a lot of verbiage. That which follows in the second table, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, it's boom, boom, boom. But before that, relative to the Sabbath, it's embellished. Much as if you look at Bereshit, Genesis, day 1, day 2, day 3, but then you get to the Sabbath in chapter 2. It goes on and on about the Sabbath and the day, and he ceased from his labors, etc. Similarly here, don't do this, don't do that. But when it comes to the Sabbath, there's more embellishment. I want to look at that which follows it at the first. to leave this with you. And then what I want to do is look at the cluster that follows and then take a leap into the Haftorah portion and suggest why there's some correlation between looking at the story of Jethro and the commandments and looking at the Isaianic passage in chapter 6 of Isaiah. But if you will, at the first, this is another commandment where there's an embellishment. If you look in verse 12, honor your father and your mother, command. But then appended to that is a statement that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. It's the only commandment here where attached to the commandment itself is to do this in order that, to use the language of the text, in order that your days might be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. And then it follows, don't murder, don't this, da, 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 da. You all with me here? Now, what's with that expansion? Honor your father and your mother. A reason why, quite frankly, I take a lot of what I'm game to talk about usually from just stuff that happens in life for me, and you're trying to draw from that rather than just go preach sermons, that I had written down some time back and bringing it out again. I'm more interested in what's written on the heart and what's written in the text than my notes. And I've been around long enough where I am inclined to do it extemporaneously. Yesterday, I was driving to work. I'm a college professor. And in the morning, I got a phone call. And I looked at the caller ID. And I knew who it was. And I put the phone to my ear. And never in 56 years of experience have I ever heard anybody talk to me where I couldn't make sense of one single syllable. I might have been just as soon at a Pentecostal camp meeting. I couldn't understand one single syllable. But I knew exactly what he was saying between the moaning and the flush of emotion that made it impossible for this person to even clearly say a word to me. I just said, okay, listen, I'll be right there. And just, Larry's my age, and his wife a little younger, like me, served for years as a theology professor, and Larry's wife was stricken with cancer. And I'd known that she was on the downward spiral. And he told me that some time back, hospice care that was visiting the house said she has about a week left. So when I told Larry, I says, listen, 24/7, call anytime. And I've spoken to him in between. But I knew, even though I couldn't understand a word of what he was saying, I knew exactly what he was saying. Went to the house, and the reason why I wanted to be at the house is having a career as a detective, as a police officer under my belt. I know all the cops, and he was concerned with what happens when someone dies at home. And I explained this to him some weeks ago. I said, well, every death in a house is considered a homicide. It has to be ruled out. And so it'll feel impersonal. It's going to be considered as a crime scene. And that's very difficult for family members, of course, because all of a sudden that this moment, this difficult moment is intruded upon by paramedics coming in and police officers conducting something of an investigation. So I told him that when it happens, barring a miracle, call me and I'll go there and help. So I went there, and he hadn't even called the police, and I said, okay, you need to call them now. I knew every cop that had come. There were 4 or 5 that came through, and half the firefighters. An ambulance came, and the fire engine came, and I knew half of those guys just because of having responded to calls with these people in the past. In any case, standing there, and the wife, God love her, she died in an easy chair. He had woken up at 7 o'clock in the morning, and she'd gone on. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning that in conjunction with this is I'll never, ever forget the picture that's indelibly marked on my mind's eye when there are 3 daughters. 2 are on the way. But there's one daughter who's just sitting next to her mom, and her hands are on the arms. And the daughter is just staring at her and holding her hand. A daughter in her 20s looking at her mom and just rubbing her hands. I mean, I'm not a guy that's given to emotion. I'm not particularly effusive. My wife is a shrink, and she wishes I'd be more in touch with my feelings. But just to describe it, just that relationship between a child and a parent, the bond, the closeness, observing it in that context gives some kind of credence to what I'm reading here. And I only mention that because we live in a culture today where it is so easy for children to be estranged from parents. I see this happen with marriages. They go off, and we do need to develop our own sense of who we are and differentiate. But I see and I hear way too many stories of people moving on, of children moving on in life and throwing their parents under the bus, just pushing away. And for women particularly, the more so, men, we derive a lot of what we're all about with our work in life, but with mom, in so many ways and so many days, the work is much more intrinsically connected to the children who developed in them, who came forth from them. And for those kids to move on and then disrespect their moms. Here it says, honor your father and mother. When the commandments are replicated in Vayikra, in Leviticus, it changes it. And it doesn't say honor your father and your mother. It says honor your father and your mother. It's the same thing, but there's a twist there. Sacred is the bond. I want to give you an example. He says here, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged upon the earth. There's one other time in the Torah where there's a command, and appended to the command is the same, that your days might be prolonged upon the earth. I'd like you to go with me, please, to Devarim, to Deuteronomy. And I want to look, please, in chapter 22. And this will be a rather prima facie, face value, and insignificant set of mandates. But I think you'll see it significant when you look a little more closely at it. Therein, we're told, if a bird's nest, in verse 6, 22:6, if a bird's nest happens to be before you along the way in any tree or on the ground with young ones or eggs, you know, I have a lot of land, not a lot of land, but a lot of land. And there's trees. And let's say lightning strikes, and that's happened before, and a branch falls down. That's happened before as well. And sometimes it falls on the house. Bummer on that. I got to hire people to come and cut the tree. You know, the branch get off my house. Or it's just there in the yard, and I've had on more than one occasion to have to call and get those trees removed. Well, you're walking on the way, and there's a branch that has fallen down. And he says here that in the branch, there's a nest. He says, if a bird's nest happens to be before you along the way in any tree or on the ground with young ones or eggs, with a mother sitting on the young or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. It's morning time and you see the eggs and you think, egg McMuffin sandwich. Or you see the little chicks there and you think, McNuggets. Now, since that parasha in Genesis, we're told that we're allowed to eat beef. And I'm glad for that. I've lost 20 pounds in an Atkins diet in the last 5 weeks, so I'm all about beef. We know in Bereshit that we're allowed to eat beef. But here what happens is you're walking down the way and you see a bird's nest there with eggs or little chicks. And it's noted explicitly in the literature that you see the mother with them, you're not allowed to take them. In verse 7, you shall surely let the mother go and take the young for yourself. And then he says, that it may be well with you and that you may prolong your days on the earth. There you have appended to that in the Torah. If you see a bird's nest and eggs there, and you're thinking, Egg McMuffin, Chicken McNuggets, ka-ting, your mind gets spinning. If the mother bird is there, do not touch. You are not allowed to take the young with the mother. And then it says that your days might be prolonged upon the earth. The same kind of appendage to in the Decalogue in the Latin, in the 10 words, in the Luchos, in the 10 Commandments. Noted in Shmot and Exodus. Honor your father and mother, that your days might be prolonged upon the earth. Not only do you find that there in relationship to a man or woman and his or her father and mother, similarly then in Devarim and Deuteronomy, so sacred is the bond between a parent and a child. So sacred is the bond, it even extends to the smallest in the animal kingdom. It has to be held inviolate. It's sacred. And that's really the issue, by the way, about kosherut, about you do not boil a calf in its mother's milk, where the way that morphs in rabbinic Judaism is you have food staples that are fleische, that are beef, and milka, which are dairy products. And that's why you don't have a cheeseburger, because it says you don't mix a calf in its mother's milk. But really the issue there, if you look at a mother's milk, the mother's milk is there to nurture and bring up the young so it may have sustained life. And it's deemed perverse to take that which is initially manufactured by God and in creation for the upbringing and the development of the child, to use it to marinate the child for your own consummation. For your own, using that in order to contribute toward your own wanting to consume the child. It's deemed, the milk is there for life. And in some sense, relative to life, when you eat the calf, there's destruction for your own life. And the mixing of the two is deemed incongruous with biblical virtue. People say, well, in the Christian church, well, I just don't believe, the Old Testament, we have the new book, and that's the Jew book, and this New Testament is for us, and that Jew book is for them, and there's a big chasm between the two, and, the law, we're not under the law. Hey, listen, the law isn't a bunch of rules thrown at people. There's principles, there's perspective, and if you can tell me what in this has no application for today, I'd be interested in knowing it. It has a lot of application for today. It has a lot in a world where there's families that are all twisted and distant and all the rest. And in fact, just conversely, before I move on from the point, just being kind toward animals, about just giving a kind of decency and kindness toward a little bird, a mother bird and her young, a human being has to be sensitive to that. Do you know that, you do know that Avraham, when he was looking for a wife for this son of his, Yitzchak, he dispatches his steward, Eliezer, to go to Padan Aram, Syria, to find a woman. That was back in the day when your old man did it for you. I had to labor myself. And they kept saying, let's just be friends. Hey. In any case, when it was time, you laugh. Believe me, it was painful. Thank you. It's all about timing, guys. Just to let you know what happened. I ran into this woman, Patty. She turned 30 and she was not married, and she was feeling a little desperate. She lowered her standards, and then I showed up, baby. It's all about timing. You got to get them at the right moment. But what happens here is, she was praying for God to bring the right man. He didn't show up, and there I was, and she ka-ting, hit 30, and so she was just in the mood to buy. And I was in the mood to sell, so business is business. Okay. What happens is Eliezer goes to Padanaram, Syria, and he's looking for a special woman. Now, he's coming there with, he's got, money, because, Abraham's doing well for himself. So he shows up there, and he's got, caravan of camels, with goods and, oriental carpets. And, he's got Rolex watches to flash in front of the family. And he's got a little Jaguar, not an animal, but a brand new Jaguar with chrome finishing, nice leather interior. He's going to impress the in-laws. And listen, how about a daughter? And listen, here, we'll give you this in exchange. He's got a little title deed to a custom home in Malibu. I mean, he's doing well. But what he wants isn't just any kind of woman. Because there are people that will hop onto something like that because someone's got, they'll hop onto that. But what he wanted, when he was there, he prayed. He says, listen, Lord, I want you to bring a special kind of girl. And the litmus test was, when I go there, if there's a woman, and here I am, a perfect stranger, and he goes there as the sun is setting, so it's late, and this woman shows up, and what he wants is someone who won't just be kind to him, a stranger, but who likewise will be willing of their own accord to water his camels. Kindness to animals. So what happens is this woman shows up, the sun is going down, she's not only kindly disposed toward him, Eliezer, this dusty guy just got off the road. But not only that, of her own accord, she volunteers to water the camels. That's just not a question of turning on the spigot and the water pours out. It's one bucket at a time, and camels, for God's sake. That's like filling up a tractor trailer. It's not just 20 gallons and down the road, they keep... I mean, you have a woman who's entrepreneurial, she's industrious, she's engaged, she's got a good work ethic, a loving and caring and sharing. But the litmus test was for someone who would be kind to human beings and kind to animals. The one who would bring forth the children of Israel, if you will, the mother of that, was attested to being the mother for that by virtue of how she was toward animals. In other words, how does she perform when nobody's looking? I remember once a police briefing, and I want to move on beyond this and look at someone who did well and then started to live like an animal. I want to consider the next section here, because I don't have all day. By the way, what time do we go out till? No, what time? No, you're kind. But when is the No, I'll get done at 1 o'clock. You're giving me 2 o'clock, 5 o'clock, believe me. If I listened to you, they'd all be mad. Like there's an old saying, I love a finished speaker, I really, truly do. I don't mean one who's polished, I just mean one who's through. I remember once there was a police briefing, and you get these little trainings. The supervisor comes out and gave us a piece of paper to look at. And it was about when you respond to a 911 call, and I've done a zillion of those, and when you do that, when you go to a home, whether it's an apartment or a house, whatever, and you see neglect or abuse of animals, it's an apartment, the cat's not fed, whatever. If you see neglect or abuse of animals, there's a 100% correlation between that. There will be neglect and abuse of human beings. It's going to happen. And then there was a study on that done by some sociologists and psychologists on individuals that are doing hard time in penitentiary for crimes against persons. And without exception, they all, when they were younger, abused animals. You get a little story of the boys, they get a spider, little boys, and they pull out the legs. Or stories of, you got a cat, and you took a cigarette, and you put it in the chest. Boys can be cruel. And if you think, well, that can prevail in the culture, in the Jewish world, do you know that in the Jewish world, you're not even allowed to hunt for sport? Are you aware of that? You can't even hunt for sport. Because the thinking is, here's that moose, here's Bullwinkle. You go into someone's house and there's Bullwinkle sticking his head out. When God made Bullwinkle, he wasn't thinking about, I know a man that's going to need to adorn his den. Maybe Bullwinkle's got a family. Maybe there's little Bullwinkles that the moose is trying to provide for. And if someone thinks there's any great merit in having the big killer gun and sitting there going kapoom and blowing away the animal just for bragging rights, it's construed there's something perverse just to take life for sport. So in the Jewish world, it's unacceptable. But I, gracious as I am and realizing this is Texas, I've decided to say, listen, that's the principle, but I'll make one exception. If you want to take on Bullwinkle, you can do it. But what I want you to do is get some crazy glue, get some antlers and staple it onto you, or glue it onto your forehead. And then go out there in the bush, and there's you with your rack, and then there's Bullwinkle with his rack, and go at it. And if you win the contest, God bless. I don't want to get in the way of the male testosterone being the king of the jungle. If you win, hey, then you stick Bullwinkle on your den, and if Bullwinkle wins, then he can stick your head on his. At least then it's a fair fight. But this $2,000 rifle, kaboom, and blowing away life, that doesn't abide. In any case, I'm getting too carried away with the point because you look remotely interested. My point here is simply to underscore that if you look in the Torah, honor your father and your mother. When I am in some fresh sense engaging the luchos, the tablets, the commandments, when I don't have time to do all of them, I wanted to take something from each category, the first 5 and then the second. Principally reminded as I was by that heart-wrenching story of one of my good friends. All that disequilibrium and kind of getting a window on a family where a daughter was just touching, just her mother. And then actually later on in the day then I had, with my wife, met with someone, was talking, one of those stories about, the daughter marries and now doesn't want to have anything to do with her mother anymore, kind of pushing off. And so I just thought in that world where I've heard enough stories of people forgetting their parents as they make their journey from the womb to the tomb, pushing away on that, I just wanted to remind that there are blessings associated with endeavoring to stay connected in some sense to our family of origin, even while we differentiate. You with me here? Secondly then, when I look at these commandments, when I look at the second set, and if you will just briefly with me, if you look in verses 13 and on then, you shalt not murder, not to commit adultery, not to steal, not to bear false witness, and then finally in verse 17, not to covet. It seems to me that here, what they all have in common are the lack of an individual's being able to control their impulses, their acquisitive impulses. And, anger, morphs into someone's disappointed in another human being for reasons real or imagined, and then it translates into anger, and then there are natural concomitants, things that just spring from that well. Similarly, there are acquisitive impulses. I want this and I want that, and that's seizing. And there's something about not maintaining an internal locus of control, where individuals absent that are all too easily bested by their various impulses that aren't bridled by any kind of social conscience or religious mores, but rather just giving free vent. I want, so I seize. I am angry, so I explode. That lack of comportment, that lack of being able to carry oneself. While we all do become disappointed and get frustrated and angry, well, we all do that. And while we all have various impulses, be they sexual, material, and otherwise, while those things can and do exist within the minds and the hearts of human beings, that stuff that if it's left unmanaged, it becomes deleterious. It becomes harmful for the person. And, people talk about breaking the commandments. I can assure you, people don't break the commandments. People break themselves against them. That is, individuals break themselves. But these principles, people can debate, well, now that I'm interested in the Jewish story and the Jesus story, what do I want to do? Am I allowed to eat a piece of bacon between two pieces of bread? People can debate that. And even if you conclude wrongly, you can get forgiven for the mistake with relative ease. But you'll have more difficulty getting forgiven if you have some woman other than your wife between the two sheets. That doesn't go away as quickly. People can debate, well, what are we talking about here? Are we duty-bound and obligated for Shabbat, as in the seventh day of the week, or can we step aside from that and just develop community celebrating the birth of Yeshua on the first day of the week? Good people can differ when they want to sit and have some kind of experience like this, where we sing songs to the Lord and about the Lord and are reminded in our heart of hearts about the Lord, and then someone endeavors to get up and, with an open Bible, tender some explanation about what they think they're seeing. Good people can debate the merits of one day or another. Someone can be right, someone can be wrong, but it's not, people can get away with the difference. But what you can't get away from, less than which day you want to think of Saturday and Sunday, if people don't live by these principles Monday through Friday, you won't get away with that. You won't get away with that. There are 168 hours in a week. What day someone puts their tuchus on a bench? For 2 of those hours, to me, important as that is, and there are things to discuss in that, is less important than what someone does with their life for the 166 other hours. Never mind where someone sits on a Saturday or a Sunday, but how do people tend to their business when they're sitting behind their desk or whatever, Monday through Friday? To what extent do individuals' acquisitive impulses get the better of them to the point where in their quest to fulfill consumer appetites, they wind up raping and pillaging and plundering other human beings to get the gold. And there's an old saying, success consecrates the foulest of crimes. When you're successful, everyone will worship you. They won't ask how you got it, but God will. God will. Let me give an evidence thereof, and this harks to the Isaiah story. If you will, please quickly look in Isaiah chapter 6 with me. And here we have the Haftorah reading that goes in conjunction with this. And in Isaiah chapter 6, we come upon, in verses 1 through 10, the call of Isaiah. Isaiah was a prophet. Now, there's different words in the Hebrew Bible for a prophet. There's Navi as prophet. And etymologically, if you look at the root of the word Navi, it means to bubble forth. There's something within the kushkis, in the guts, and then it bubbles forth. There's also a word for prophet, roe, which means a seer. And if you look at Isaiah the prophet, he's less the seer. It's like if you look at Ezekiel the prophet, he's a seer. And Ezekiel definitely was a Pentecostal. The Spirit lifted me up and took me here, and the Spirit showed me, and God said to me. That guy was definitely assembled of God, assemblies of God. He definitely was a Pentecostal. I mean, he goes to the Benny Hinn crusades every time he's in town. Ezekiel. Isaiah, on the other hand, was a Southern Baptist. He's not given to all the spectacular language and visionary stuff. There's only one time where Isaiah has this heavens opened and I saw. And the moment for that is the story for today, the Haftorah portion. We're here relative to his own call. Someone says, Raphael called into the ministry, brother. The word call comes from the Latin word vocatio. And the word it's the word voice, vocation. Well, what's your vocation? Well, I feel called to be a psychologist, called to be a computer guy, called to be a mechanic, or called to be a physician. The call, the word vocation, well, that's my vocation. The word vocation comes from the word for voice, vocatio. Someone hears a voice. Someone hears a phone ringing. I think that's mine. My bad. A little bit of grace here, please. Tell you why I left it on is because last night, my friend Larry, I told him I'm here for you 24/7. And, he's going through, the disequilibrium that you experience with the death of a loved one like that. I said, you call me anytime. And what it is, I put my phone on silent except for phone calls only. I didn't want the vibrator because I'm a tired guy. I'm on an Atkins diet. I'm tired already, and it's only 1 o'clock. I knew when I went to sleep, kathum, I'll go down, and that's why I had the ringer on. My bad, I didn't make the switch. In any case, here Isaiah, when he's called into the ministry, he has this vision of God on the throne, and if you look at me, he sees this vision. Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzevot, in verse 3, Holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. He sees the Lord there in this magisterial setting, and he feels unworthy to even be there to observe it. You look in verse 5, he says, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Oh my God, I shouldn't even be here to see this. Why is that pericope employed in conjunction with the luchos, the Ten Commandments? I'd like you to go with me to 2 Chronicles chapter 26. And as you're turning there, I just want to remind you of chapter 6, verse 1 in Isaiah. He says, in the year that King Uzziah died. Who was Uzziah? Who was Isaiah in relationship to him that somehow Uzziah's death becomes the catapult to launch Isaiah into the ministry? And what could that conceivably do with the luchos, with the Ten Commandments? And how can I answer all that in 7 minutes? If you look in 2 Chronicles chapter 26, there's a story here about Uzziah who comes to the kingdom when he's 16 years old. Now, he's really too young to administer the affairs of the kingdom. So a regent is appointed to help as a counselor, to help guide him, to serve as an advisor. And this regent is minded to encourage Uzziah to serve the Lord, to seek the Lord, to do right by the Lord. And as you read through chapter 26, what happened is Uzziah prospers as a result of it. And if you look at his realm, it's cascading upwards to its zenith. The chronicler goes on to record he became successful and stronger than anyone at any time. Never mind some ad hoc militia that fights his battle, but standing armies, uniform colors and paraphernalia, organized, disciplined. The walls that he built, the ramparts, have towers established tall. He's developed siege engines, paraphernalia for war, and we're told that he excels beyond everybody and anybody, such that he's well respected in the region. You all with me here? Okay, but what does that have to do with Isaiah? You'll see this in a second. What happens is we're told when he's at his zenith, when he's at his most powerful, what happens is he decides that this isn't enough. He's more acquisitive still. If you look in verse 16 of chapter 26, we're told, quote, but when he was strong, his heart was lifted up to his destruction. For he transgressed against the Lord his God by entering into the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. You know, there was a separation between the magisterium, the kingdom, and the Levitical stuff. Separate offices. But what happens is he not only runs the realm, but like perhaps kings round about, he wanted to head up the religious. He wanted to be, you know, the high priest as well. So he takes liberties. He served God, and so God elevated him, but now he is transgressing. He's wanting more than what he was entitled to. We're told that, so he goes in there to do it. In verse 17, Azariah the priest went in after him, and with him were 80 priests of the Lord, valiant men. And they withstood King Uzziah and said, "It is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord, but for priests. Get out of the sanctuary, if you have transgressed, you have trespassed. You shall have no honor from the Lord God." Then Uzziah became furious. "Who are you to tell me what to do? I'm the king. You're just some worthless piece of human wreckage. I have power." And he's just so used to it. You know, he's used to, you know, everybody just, you know, he's used to imposing his will and his way. And he's out of control with his impulses. And they won't be bridled by the conventions of biblical literature, by the requirements, and he won't listen to advice. Like Moses did in a previous generation, as we're told, as we're reminded of in the beginning of the parasha this morning. Wouldn't have it. In verse 20, and Azariah, the chief priest, and all the priests looked at him. Well, I should say in verse 19. Then Uzziah became furious. He had a censer in his hand to burn incense. And while he was angry with the priests, leprosy broke out on his forehead before the priests in the house of the Lord beside the incense altar. And Azariah, the chief priest, and all the priests looked at him. And there on his forehead he was leprous. So they thrust him out of that place. Indeed, he also hurried to get out because the Lord had struck him. King Uzziah was a leper until the day of his death. He dwelt in an isolated house because he was a leper, for he was cut off from the house of the Lord. Here was a man who had everything, but he was bested by his acquisitive impulses. He got too intoxicated by it, more and more, and he wouldn't listen to the Lord. He wouldn't listen to those who were his representatives. I gotta seize it. So what happened is he was smitten, and he who had everything wound up living the rest of his life as though he had nothing. It's like, what's the good of being Bill Gates if you don't have the health to enjoy what you've amassed? He's got nothing. Okay, what does this have to do with Isaiah? We're told in the Isaianic passage of the 6th chapter, in the year that Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, and his train filled the temple. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. And I've seen this, and I'm unclean. I'm not worthy to go there with the incense swinging in God's presence. What's the connection between Isaiah and all this? You know what Isaiah did before he became a prophet? Well, he went to prophet school. You know, he had an MBA degree, but instead of my own business, I want to do the Lord's business. Then he goes to seminary. Was it Dallas Seminary? Was it Christ for the Nations Institute? South? He went to seminary. Is that what he did? No. You know what he did before he became a prophet? He was the court historian. And I'll tell you how I know that in a second. Isaiah, before he ever planted his feet and started making biblical history, Isaiah was there just recording what was happening. And because he was close up and in the palace, because he was there as the chronicler, he knew the story well. He knew what happened to Uzziah. The reason why I say that, we're told in verse 21 that King Uzziah was a leper until the day of his death. He dwelt in an isolated house, etc. And then after recording his death in verse 22, now the rest of the acts of Uzziah from first to last, the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amos, wrote. Isaiah was his biographer. He knew up close and personal What becomes of people that are bested by their acquisitive impulses and they want to throw the 10 Commandments behind their backs? They don't want to honor God. They don't want to keep His commandments. They don't want to live in a way that's prudent and equitable with other human beings. They want to seize and plunder and have, and they're bested by those impulses. Isaiah was the chronicler that wrote his story. And because he looked at it and knew it, Isaiah was touched by it. And then, if you look now, please, in Isaiah chapter 6 again, and then I'm done. And ain't it good when the preacher says he's done, that he's actually done? You ever have those preachers, they go, and finally, and for my last point, and then it drones on 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 50. For God's sake, I thought it was the last point. The last point that I want to make here, and then I'll share what the Lord's put. In chapter 6, verse 1, in the year that Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on the throne, high and lifted up. And he sees these angelic creatures in verse 3. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The word holy, kadosh, harks to the word to be separate, a little distinguished from. And the posts of the door were shaken. And Isaiah's there. He doesn't even see himself as worthy to see this, even though he didn't walk into it. He was just transported into it. After seeing what happened to Uzziah, and now for him to be up close and personal with God like this, he was afraid for his own life. Woe is me, I'm undone. And then, of course, he's commissioned to go forth and tell God's people. Well, what have we learned from our treatment of the Scripture today, if anything? What I wanted to do this morning, by the way, I think it's just best for minister, not to get up and talk about my ministry and ain't it great, but rather just to do the literature, just to farm the text. And on the menu for today was Jethro, and there was a Haftorah portion assigned to it. I think there's soul food in the story. And what I wanted to do this morning is just look at the interplay, the intermarriage story. When I look at the Jethro story and consider all that, I'm reminded of things that are a little more, it's not as cleanly delineated. There's more confluence, there's more interrelationship between Hebrew people and other people. And that inclines me to be a little more open-minded, put it like that. And it inclines me to want to figure out how I can be more kindly disposed toward my estranged Arab cousins. I mean, if Moses can marry into the family, why can't I find ways to build bridges? And to endeavor to do that. Hence, the upshot of that was a book, Making Our Peace with the Warriors of the Sand, exploring all the biblical narrative I can get my hands on that deal with that kind of thing. And then as I evolved from that to look at some of the commandments, I'm reminded of how sacred is the bond between parents and children. And inasmuch as I'm reminded of that, I want to encourage you in that regard, too, with your family and so forth. I thought that would probably be good because it's biblical, because it says appended to that is that your days might be long. Success somehow is correlated with getting that one right. So I wanted to commend that to you. And then I wanted to look at a cluster. Don't kill, don't this and that. It has to do with the way we treat other people. And the thread between that, in my mind's eye, speaks of acquisitiveness. The way we manage impulse as well. Anger, feeling, I got to have this and got to have that. Personally, closing illustration, I would much rather, I've raised boys. God hasn't graced me with raising girls. Probably lucky for girls. My boys, when I get frustrated, I've threatened to, sell them into slavery. I've threatened to trade them in for girls. It's one of those how it all sketched out. Well, maybe they are a little bit. I got so into that point, I forgot my closing point. I only write notes. My wife writes these notes for me for the speeches and says, if you just stick with notes, you won't get yourself in trouble. But no, I want to show off and act like I just memorized her points. I forget what it was, but you probably get the points anyway. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be with you this morning. May the Lord bless the ministry of the word. Thank you.